So this article is an attempt to think through how linguistic anthropologists can add to the critical discussion around NAGPRA. NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So it's based on my research with the Hopi community. I've been visiting as a researcher, friend, and colleague for about 10 years now. So to understand the article, I think it's important to understand a little bit about NAGPRA. So NAGPRA is US federal legislation passed in 1990, and it established a process whereby federally recognized tribes could reclaim certain objects from museum collections and have them returned or repatriated to their communities. So I say object because that's the phrase that's used in the legislation, but for Indigenous communities making these claims, terms like relations, belongings, ancestors, beings are usually more appropriate. So a lot of the critical scholarship on NAGPRA has shown that it's not really just this simple process of return. It creates all kinds of new social relations between, for instance, tribes and museums. So I too am interested in those elements of repatriation that seem to sort of exceed the process of return. So even though repatriation is ostensibly about returning tangible heritage from museums to tribal communities, I found that it can actually have participating in the repatriation process, I should say, can actually have discursive effects in Indigenous speech communities. So by that, I mean it can impact how people talk about themselves, how people talk about cultural property. And I think that's largely due to parameters set up by NAGPRA that determines who can make a claim and what makes a claim eligible. So in the article, I explore different examples of how Hopi speakers strategically adapt to these parameters set out by NAGPRA and show how participating in repatriation has, for instance, allowed people to make relevant certain forms of group identity or positionality that might really not be relevant otherwise. One thing that's important to me in the article is I try to emphasize that there's lots of diversity in terms of how Indigenous speech communities in terms of speech in Indigenous speech communities. So that in itself is not that important, but it becomes important to pay attention to when it seems like one group is always accommodating the norms of another group. So there's a kind of asymmetry produced. And then given this, I also try to make the case in the article that if Indigenous communities like Hopi are expected to discursively adapt to participate in the repatriation process, we should also ask if the inverse is true. So how might outside interlocutors like museums, anthropologists like myself, other people involved in repatriation, how can they be responsive to Hopi-specific norms of communication when discussing collections in ways that might help to balance that asymmetry that I mentioned?